Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, hosted by Dave Jenkins. The Equipping You in Grace podcast is a podcast about helping Christians develop a biblical worldview in a conversational tone about issues inside and outside the church. Now, for today's episode, let's join our host, Dave Jenkins.
All right, guys, welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this show. And with me is our friend and brother in Christ, Jim Wallace. Jim, welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, brother.
Glad to be back with you. These are important issues. I'm glad to get a chance to talk about them.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Before we get started on today's topic and I introduce it, can you just briefly catch us up on what's been happening in your life, marriage, ministry, and any ministry projects that you're working on? I know you've been working on a book, right?
Yeah. Actually, they just finished the first draft, and now I'm just kind of doing some revisions on it. It's called The Truth and True Crime, and it's just 15 attributes of human nature, things you learn about the meaning of life from investigating deaths. So it's kind of a book that kind of gives you principles to help you live a more, to leverage these attributes of nature, of our human nature to flourish. So there's some aspect of that in it, but also these 15 attributes are really an evidence for Christianity because they are, although we're just talking about them in the last 30 to 50 years in terms of the sociological studies, they are very ancient. They're all in the pages of the New Testament. So I kind of look at it this way. If you're aiming at human flourishing, you're going to hit this bullseye called Christianity every time, because it just turns out that if you will adopt the teaching of the New Testament, we are designed in such a way that we will flourish. Wow. So that's kind of what we're doing in that book, and also getting ready next less than 3 weeks now. We're getting ready to head back up to Alaska to do marital counseling, resiliency training with police officers and their wives with Billy Graham Association, which we do every year. This year we're doing it for 6 weeks, so we'll be off the grid here for about 6 weeks, coming up really quick.
Well, thank you for your ministry to to the larger community of the body of Christ, but also, to the police officers. That is, so important.
It's been a growing part of what we do. And a lot of it's just kind of focused on marriage issues, but it's a unique subset of our culture that experiences different things. So they have different issues,
So tell us, today's topic, we are going to talk about, police today, guys. Mm-hmm. And, Jim, you are called, I think, by some America's detective. Yeah, tell us a little bit about, that experience, just so people know, a little bit about that as we get into it.
Well, I just kind of dumbed into it. I was kind of my dad was a cop. And so I saw him growing up, and, you always want to be like your dad. So I always knew I saw it as this virtuous kind of noble profession that was a calling, but I was not a Christian growing up. So I would never called it a calling, but even people who don't believe that there's a caller, I kind of sense it as a calling. So I think that there is a part of that. And I was trained in the arts. I got a bachelor's degree in fine art, a master's degree in architecture. And then when I was working as an architect, I just didn't see, Susie and I didn't see, I just felt like that law enforcement, I was really quite selfish. I thought law enforcement was a better job to raise kids in. Yeah. And so I switched over in the police academy, and then spent the next, 25 years working in an agency in Los Angeles County. And most of that time was spent working in homicide investigations. So that's kind of the background that I was in. But, you have to go through all the other stuff before you're going to get assigned to homicide. So you have to spend your time in patrol, which I did. I worked gangs for a couple of years. I worked undercover for about 4. And then I worked SWAT for 3. And then the rest of that time I was working in homicides. Yeah.
Wow. So, I'll just set the stage here. We, in the last couple of years, especially, everybody here, if you watch the news at all, you've seen riots, during COVID, you see rallies, violent protests on the news. And as I've seen this, I'm just like taking it in. I'm thinking, I don't see anybody really like talking about too much about these things. And then I see you, over here on your page and writing on, police matters and things like that. And I'm like, wait, I know Jim. Why not have Jim on to talk about this? I mean, there's nobody that I could think of that I know that would be good. It's like, you don't, somebody could get up on a podcast, right, and talk about it. But before we were recording this, I was like telling my wife, I'm like, but it's so much more effective when you have somebody with your kind of experience, to really speak to the issues and, from a biblical worldview, because you're solid theologically. And so I'm excited about this, brother. So starting off, why should Christians care about what happens to police?
Well, I think it's because we care what happens to culture, right? We want, well, first and foremost, we want to live in a place where hopefully we can freely worship, where we have the ability to do that, and that there's not, that it's a safe environment in which to do it. But we also want to live in an environment where we can freely preach the gospel, or share the gospel with others. So I think because we have a concern about culture, and here's why I think that's important with law enforcement. It turns out, and I've been saying this for a number of years, that law enforcement is the one necessary profession upon which every other profession is contingent. So if you are working in some other profession, you can thank a police officer for the ability to do it freely, because you could be a doctor, but if you're concerned that your next patient's going to rob you instead of pay you, you're going to need someone there to enforce the laws that really allow you the freedom to practice medicine. And so it turns out that this is true for, we talk sometimes after COVID about essential services. And it seems like everything's an essential service. The person who's delivering groceries to your front door, that's now an essential service. Okay, fine. There may be a category, we would say, of essential services. But of all of those, the one foundational service is that guy going to get robbed on the way to delivering your product? You have to have cops in place first. And that's why, and this is not, when I say it, I don't say it to kind of convey that cops are special. No, they're just foundational. And let's face it, most of us pay no attention to our foundations until they start to crack. These are the things you walk on, spit on, pee on, drop trash on. And this is why cops, when they go through the academy, they are abused by their drill instructors the same way they are in the military, because we want to make sure that we take all of the offense out of you. So you're not going to be offended on the outside. Whatever we did, we're taking that part of your nature out of you, because we know that that's what people do to foundations. They take them for granted. They don't particularly care for them. And what this also means is if you are an employee at a law enforcement agency, you need to understand that the bar is a lot higher for you. We can't tolerate any misbehavior. And that's why when we see misbehavior on the part of police officers, it's so utterly repugnant, because we know that this is the one area. If you don't have confidence in the law enforcement agency or the investigative agency, you're toast. That's the stuff that if you don't have confidence in that group, well, that you don't have confidence, then you're done. So, and this is why I think you see this happening culturally right now, right? You get people who are starting to lose confidence in the agencies that are supposed to be the ones that determine what's true about something and then make sure that the bad guy goes to jail. Well, if you think the guy who's doing that is the bad guy, well, that's really, really hard. That's why we're seeing this panic over law enforcement, because we see there are people who do stupid things. Now, here's what I'll say about that. And we see it all the time. We're having this conversation and we see these riots because, yeah, there's some discord about what's happening in the country, but there's also discord about police officers generally. And if George Floyd incident hadn't happened, we'd be having a very different conversation.
Amen.
And so what you see, though, is people will say to me, well, how in the world did they ever allow someone like this police officer to get hired? Okay, well, there's a dirty little secret. Here's the dirty little secret. This is a terrible job that nobody should have to do. And there's an entire subculture of criminal behavior in our country that most people, they think it exists. They know, they see it in some TV shows, but until you're in it every day, it's hard to explain what cops are going to see on a day-to-day basis that's living right next door to you in the house that's next door. You never have to go in that house to see how ugly it is, but the cop does. So he knows that while there's the surface kind of Instagram view of reality that everyone is living in, there's this behind the scenes ugliness that nobody's aware of. And we have really high hiring standards. So we're going to go through all of your background. It's going to be a physical, a psychological, everyone you've dated in the last 5 years, whoever you've lived next door to in the last 5 years, everyone you know, all those people are going to get talked to. That's not true for probably many other positions that you hire into. But what happens is, if you look at this ugly underworld for 10 years, you become the guy who does something you shouldn't do. And then you end up prosecuting that guy because he's become the person you allowed him to become. He wasn't that guy originally. But if you look at this too long, I can tell you that George Floyd thing, I watched it And I knew right away, it didn't matter. There was no racism involved in that. That was otherism. That was that this cop had been working those streets so long, probably without a rotation out, that he started to see everyone he's taken to jail as an other. There's us and them. And that's very natural if you do this job very long. And at some point, you've heard those words that guy said, that George Floyd said, you've heard them from 1,000 suspects. And every time you've heard it, it's been nonsense. And now you end up in a place where you don't trust anything that anyone's saying. And it's not because you are a terrible person we shouldn't have hired. It's you're just a normal person who, exposed to that for too long, doesn't trust anybody. And that's why we end up in terrible marriages or married many times. That's why we have a pretty, the rates of depression. And that's why a lot of guys retire from this job and they want to be isolated. They want to get away from everyone. They don't want to be talking to nobody. They want to retire in Wyoming on 100 acres with their houses in the middle on a hill with a turret. And they want to know who's coming up their driveway. That's kind of what happens to these guys because the job is terrible and nobody should have to do it. So that's, I think, where my heart is. And if we just care about our culture and the foundation of the culture, then we need to care about cops.
Yeah, that's really an important thing. I think one other thing is, we have the Constitution, and you can't have the whole principle of the Constitution. Really, I would argue, is built on the rule of law. The principle of a criminal is going to get punished for doing a wrong. And we're seeing the erosion of that. I'm reminded, as you were talking as well, just one more thing, Harold Bergman was a philosopher at Harvard, and he said, basically law can't, our system of government, it can't exist without religion. And isn't that interesting? Harvard is a secular institution.
Yeah, no kidding.
And, here's a Harvard philosopher telling us that. You can't have law without morality.
That's right.
And isn't that what we see in our post-truth culture?
Right. And how many times have you heard someone say something like, talk is cheap? Well, law is cheap if it's not enforced. You can say, well, everything you want, what you believe in legally, you can say what you believe in morally, that's expressed through laws. But if you're not willing to enforce those laws, then it's all just cheap talk. And that's kind of where we are right now, right? So I'm in Los Angeles County. I'm just south of Los Angeles County. I worked my entire career in Los Angeles County. My son's working in that county now. And we're at a place right now where we're not enforcing crimes, and we're certainly not prosecuting crimes in Los Angeles County. And this has been going on for several years. And everyone who's there, lives there, knows it. And what happens is, and this is, my son made this point, and it's very true, is that when something like George Floyd occurs, we have an instantaneous response and a catalyst into activity. Let's do something about this because we're going to stop this. But when people in law enforcement just say, well, we give up, you've tied our hands and there's nothing we can do, it takes about 10 years to see what kind of negative impact that has on your community. And it's very hard to reverse. But you don't notice that broken window syndrome for about 10 years, right? Because at first you're kind of drafting on the old view of law and order, and you haven't started to settle into. It's kind of like a generation of iPhone users. The first generation, they don't understand it. The second generation comes up, that's all they've ever known. Well, if these youngsters who are coming up in these communities who all they've ever known is that we're not enforcing laws, that's going to create you have no idea where we're headed right now. And it does concern me. And I think that, look, there's a place in Scripture, right? I just pulled it up here in Romans 13, where it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. Now, what's interesting is cops, for the most part, have looked at this and said, well, there's not a lot in the New Testament that's a parallel to law enforcement in the 21st century. There isn't. The Roman authorities clearly were the closest thing to a governing authority that would probably enforce laws. But they're a different kind of authority than a small municipal agency that deals locally and is hired out of the same citizenry to police their own. It's very different, right? But in all of Scripture, this is about as close as you're going to come to what it is police officers do. And we are called here God's servants. And the word there in the Greek there is only used by Paul and for two kinds of people. It's used for ministers of the word and for these servants of God who are working in the community. It's only used for those who are leading the church and for this group. And so this is truly a calling. And if you care what happens to how your pastors behave, because the church should care about that, then the church should also be concerned about what happens to police officers, because the same word is being used for both. And I just think that we have to kind of see this for what it is. It's God ordained, and it's important. And it turns out that if you look at how our government works, it's foundational. Let's face it. When Wild West was being settled, you had volunteer firemen and you had people who were making a living, but the first hired employee of the city is the sheriff. Well, why? In California, I think it's 1830 or 1850 is when we were founded as a state. And you'll see that every county law enforcement, every county sheriff has the exact same start date, because the first order of business when you were trying to establish a new territory is the county sheriff's department. So I think that's why we see this as important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's really well said. Really well said. How should Christians think about the recent trend about the defund police movement? Yeah,
I just, it's not going to, first of all, sometimes when I hear it, it's sensational, it's click-worthy, but I don't know that it's never going to happen. And it will happen it'll happen in a short season. This happened in Minneapolis for a short season. And then what happens is you just don't feel safe anymore. And then you end up spending more money trying to correct the problem. Because remember, we don't just hire anybody. We hire people, and it takes about a year to get them street worthy. So you'll go through all the hiring process, takes about 2-3 months. You finally get them in the academy. Now we're 6 months into training. Now we're 9 months into the process. You get them out. They're in 3 to 7 months of training and a year of probation. So you can't just instantly put 100 people on the street or 1,000 people on the street. It'll take you a couple of years to get those kind of people, because the attrition rate and the failure rate is incredibly high. So it's just not easy to hire. And then you end up overpaying, because why would anyone want to do this job? There are places, and we deal with police officers all over the country in our work with BGEA. And I will tell you that there are people who are making just slightly more than minimum wage in many places in the country.
Wow.
And they're undertrained, under-equipped, underpaid. And at some point you're asking, why would I do this? I remember talking to an officer who had been in a tragic shooting where he lost his partner. And about 2 weeks later, he's back on the job, and he's responding to a barricaded suspect at a school who's got an AR-15. And he told me, I'm en route, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't have this kind of equipment. I don't have like the ceramic plates that stops an AR-15 round. And I don't have a ballistic helmet, because we don't assign those things. And I don't have the kind of weapon that has the same kind of firepower that this guy's going to have. And he says, I will tell you, I had some trepidation about responding to it. Now, luckily, it all turned out. And the kid gave himself up. But he said, as I'm responding to this, and so I asked him what he made. He made about 60 cents an hour more than the local Starbucks made.
What?
Yeah. And I said, no way. He says, yeah, well, that's just, but it's a small county. I won't give you the state, but it was in the kind of the Southeast. And that's just what they were paying him. And so I'm asking myself, okay, so why would anyone do this? Well, because they feel it's a calling. Now, a lot of the police officers that we see up there are not saved. They're not Christians. So we're trying to help them see and help strengthen their resolve that it's a calling, because we want to introduce them to the caller. But I mean, aside from that, you can see why, if you didn't think it was a calling from God, number one, how would you, if you didn't think this was a calling, this divine, you've been a divinely appointed servant of God. If you didn't think that's what you were, as it says in Romans 13, well, then wouldn't that change the way you're going to, my language is for the most part controlled, because I have a Lord I have to answer to. I mean, there is some practical value in hiring Christian police officers. So I think you can't defund these folks, because you're never going to get them back.
Yeah.
And I think, I always say this, that we're not paid for what we do every day, every hour of every day. Because if you're in some agencies, you might spend the entire day working in the field and not really have to do all that much, because it's a slow day, quote unquote, right? But these slow days are punctuated by moments of sheer terror. You are paid for risk. That's what you're paid for. You're paid because at some point, your life's going to be on the line. You're going to have to pull your gun. You're going to have to fire it. And it's not just that you're trying to survive the shooting, but now you got to survive the criminal trial afterward that's going to accuse you of doing something you were simply like, do you think we go out wanting to get involved in a shooting? No. The best day, we're always toggling between these two objectives. The first objective is serve our community. If it means paying or laying down our lives, we swear to do that. We will lay down our lives to serve our community. And the competing desire is to get home at the end of the shift to see your kids.
Yeah.
So how do you balance those two competing interests? That's what everyone's trying to do every day. And it's going to get to the point where there's not going to be enough money like I always tell people when I speak around the country, I don't charge what I think I'm worth. I'm 62 now. I charge what one day away from my wife is worth. I charge based on her value. So I think police officers do the same kind of thing. We got to ask ourselves, well, look, it's you have a role to play as a husband, a father, and as a public servant. Now you got to ask yourself, what is that worth? What's it going to be worth to your kids if you're being prosecuted for a shooting that somebody says was not perfect? And by the way, there are no perfect shootings. There just aren't, because we aren't required to take a round before we fire a round. You're usually preemptively shooting so that you don't end up dead. Because, you think, well, look, if I wait till I take the round, what if I take the round in the forehead? I can't return fire. So I'm not required. Once he points the gun at me, I can shoot. Well, then, of course, anymore, we're in a culture where that doesn't seem to understand that. So that's why I think that the defunding notion is are you ready to have no police officers? Because that's what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I just look at it. I look at it, from my vantage point. I look at Chicago. You want to see what it's going to happen in our country. Look at Chicago, and then look at, New York City, for example. They had New York City, under control in a large way, and years ago now. But now we're seeing all this crime, and I live 2 hours away from Portland, and my wife and I, we won't even we stop there, once on the way up to Seattle. We will not stop there anymore. We won't stop anywhere. I mean, brother, we won't even stop to go to the bathroom in Portland. Okay, if you're not going to stop to go to the bathroom, okay, it's just you just drive through on I-5 North, and it just feels like, I don't even know. It feels just like a garbage town.
Well, sadly, these are places where we've kind of turned our back. There's this idea, right, that we could do this job some other way, but perhaps a better way. And perhaps it's a matter of us using an approach that's less enforcement oriented and is more formative, where we're looking at, like, what is it about the community that produces this kind of behavior? And maybe if we stepped into that role, okay, I get it, but this is a domino chain, okay? And I, like everybody else as a police officer, I hate the fact that the first and second and third dominoes of our country, of our culture, of our cities were set in such a way that now we have the 30th domino falling over, and I've got to respond to somebody who's been victimized. But you don't call me to fix. I can't fix the first domino. You call me for the 30th. It'd be like saying, okay, I've got a leak in my pipe in my sink, and so I call out a plumber, and the plumber comes, and rather than fix the problem, he says, the problem started when in California we stopped taking the water from this source and we got it from this other source, and we don't it's full of all kinds of chemicals, and those erode your pipes. And okay, look, I know there's a lot of foundation issues that led to my leaky pipe, but I called you to fix the leaky pipe. And I know that I could have called a social activist who could talk about how we could reform the water system here in California so there won't be any more leaky pipes. But to be honest, what do I do today? Because the pipe is all leaking all over my house. Right. So that's when you call a plumber, you don't expect somebody who is a strategist. Right. You expect a plumber. Right. And when you call a police officer, so I mean, if you think, by the way, you could hire strategists. By the way, what do they do when they have a leaky pipe? They call a plumber. Okay. So it turns out all the folks who want to take this job away, when it push comes to shove, they call us too. And so I think in the end, we have to kind of think about where we are in the domino chain and what is it that our role is? Because it's okay if you don't want to call us, but if you do want to call us, it's because you have a problem that, yes, it might have started 4 generations earlier, but that's not your problem today. Your problem today is you need a response. And so we have to kind of separate ourselves from those, and also recognize that yes, you might invest in people now and not have a problem 4 generations from now. Yeah. But that doesn't solve the leaky pipe. Yeah. And so that's why I think it's important for us to be kind of have our minds set and be committed as police officers that, hey, we have to kind of stand our ground, even if the culture doesn't understand this distinction. Yeah.
I think that's good, because, we can too easily point the blame at the officers, what you're saying, and forget this is a person. They're giving their life. They've sworn a duty to defend the law. And, whenever you hear a sheriff or somebody, that's a person that has given their life to that. And of course, they're going to speak up for the rule of law. And you're going to hear them talk about that on television. Whenever an emergency comes, they're one of the, like you mentioned, they're one of the first people that are on the news. They're talking about, things when a national tragedy comes out. Why do you think they have the FBI on the national TV or somebody from the FBI or so on and so forth. So,
right. And once you start losing confidence in those agencies, then you know, where do you turn next? So part of the problem is that we kind of create our own problem. Number one, we're in the job long enough to become highly cynical and pessimistic, and everyone's a liar. And that's true. I say it all the time. That's the most effective way to work cases. Assume everyone's telling you a lie, and eventually someone's going to go to jail. If you assume everyone's telling you the truth, no one ever goes to jail. So it is, just practically speaking, more effective to assume the worst in people. But so I always say it this way: when someone runs through a red light, and I see it on a patrol car, I'm going to pull that person over. Now, that person might just be late for dinner, or he might be running from a robbery. I don't know yet. So I'm going to walk up on the car, because I want to go home at the end of the shift, as if he's running from a robbery and he's armed. And as soon as I know he's not, then we're going to, hopefully you can de-escalate that. But when I'm going to walk up, I'm going to say, sir, put your hands on the steering wheel. What? I'm just late for dinner. Put your hands on the steering wheel, right? I'm going to assume the worst. Now, once I've confirmed he's just late for dinner, now the question is, does the officer, he might have a great officer safety tactic, so he knows how to make sure he stands behind the post, behind the door that's closed. The shot that the guy could take at him is going to be really difficult. He tells him to see his hands. He's got that under control. He can see the back seat's empty. He can pretty much see that the passenger seat is empty. He's doing all the things he's supposed to do from an officer safety perspective to get home at the end of the shift. But he's had to say some things that were kind of rough, kind of demanding. I need you to do this. Don't question me. I just need you to do this. And this all gets captured on video now, right? So you look like a bad guy. And then the question becomes, well, when you discover he's not a bad guy, he's just late for dinner, do you have the kind of rhetorical skills that can help you to calm the situation? And not everyone we hire at some point, they're better warriors and they get home at the end of the night than they are orators. Okay. So we have to be careful. And, this is a kind of the skill set is broadening and broadening and broadening, because we're in a culture that needs a bigger skill set than we used to have. So I think it's going to be a harder job to do going forward, right? Because we have so many ways to judge, and every video, every recording is going to be, clipped out of sequence, and it's just, you're going to do your job better. But here's the other thing you could do. You could just say, the dude ran through the red light and I could take a chance and pull this guy over. I could just let it go, because and that's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that we've gotten to the point where if you've been doing this job for 10 years and you're watching your partners be accused of all kinds of stuff, that you just decided, you know what, of the two options, doing nothing sounds good right now. And I don't ever want it to get to that point, but we got to be careful, because that's where we're headed.
Yeah. Should Christians be police?
So that comes down to the issue of, is pacifism the calling of Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a hot topic issue. And I've seen people make it from scripture on both sides of this issue. As I think the hardest passage to kind of navigate is the turning the other cheek passage from Jesus. And I think everything else you look at that you can make a case for pacifism, I think is pretty much easy to interpret and make your own decision. Obviously, as a guy who worked in the profession, I don't think you have to be a pacifist in order to be a Christian. Yeah. And I look at this passage here from Romans 13 as an example of that. But Paul's not saying that all these servants of God are Christians here. He's just saying that we ought to obey that authority because it is sent from God. So, okay, that's just different. But I think this is something that each believer, and there are entire denominations and sects of Christianity that are pacifists and could never have their kids. So that's an interesting issue. Just practically speaking, if that was the case, that means you would never once. Do we really want police agencies that there are no Christians on?
No.
So that's a practical question, but it's not a theological question. So you have to resolve. Now, I've written about this on our websites. You have to be a pacifist to be a Christian, and I get a lot of pushback on that. I don't think you do.
Oh yeah.
So I make it a case for the appropriate use, the measured use of force, and I think that there's always been that God has always given options in the Old Testament and in the New for the measured use of force. And so as long as we as Christians recognize that we have to use force in a measured way, that we can support. From a biblical perspective, that we defended ourselves, defended the life of an innocent. Mm-hmm. Those are those situations in which I would have to use whatever force necessary, up to and including deadly force, in order to protect my own life and protect the life of an innocent.
Yes.
And that's really where we are focused as police officers. Now, I get it. You may not agree with that, but I don't think we want a world in which there are no believers on police agencies.
Yeah. That's really well said. This next question is particularly relevant because, well, I live in Oregon, and, Portland is only 2 hours away from me, headquarters of Antifa. So how should Christians think about the recent attacks on police by groups like Antifa?
Yeah, and and this is how I kind of parse this out. To me, it doesn't matter what every response to force or response to criminal behavior is just specific to the kinds of force or the kind of criminal behavior. So when in New York City, when they were looking at how to deal with organized crime there, which was literally family crime, it was mafia type level crime, organized crime, they just started to employ laws that made it possible to go after the entire group when one of them was caught on basis of criminal conspiracies. And they just leveraged a law that allowed them then. So instead of just picking off one guy for selling dope or doing a murder, and then he's not going to rat on anybody in the family, if they could put this all together, they could do they could leverage a federal law that allowed them to prosecute it as a conspiracy. In other words, they did something specific to that larger group. So when I hear that a group is involved in violence, or a group, well, I think we need to just think about what laws do we have in place that we can leverage for that. It's going to be different than a single guy who's doing a series of liquor store robberies, or a gang of, I've done this before, where a gang of 20 guys in the same group, in the same gang, street gang, that are doing bank robberies for a season. Well, you're going to approach this in a different way because each one is different. Now, I don't think of them as any more or less a threat than any other criminal or group of criminals. So when I look at Antifa, I just say, okay, look, this is, in the end, if it continues to be a problem and you want to address it, it's not as though we don't have the laws in place and the investigative minds in place that could figure out how to put an end to it. Here's the problem. We have no collective will to put an end to it. So in those places where Antifa is doing its work the most vigorously, it's because they know there is no collective will to stop them in those communities. Maybe there would be the citizenry, but whoever they're electing, and that's what it comes down to. This, for example, you don't see this happening in large swaths of the South because there's still a collective will to knock that stuff off. So it's only happening in those places where they've either restricted law enforcement or they just hired people who just don't care like the people who are elected. So it's not as though we don't have the capacity to stop it. We could stop it all in a week. It's, do we have a will to stop it?
Yeah, and I think something that you're touching on, and what I'm hearing you say, maybe our listeners maybe won't pick up on it, but I am, is behind the things that you're talking about are the worldview of the people that are doing that behavior. And this is a whole entire worldview. And I just want to be clear about this. Wherever you're at on the political spectrum, I don't even care.
Right.
But what we should care about is these people. I mean, you look at Portland. This was on the national TV. It's a known example. They attacked a federal courthouse.
That's right.
If you're an American and you're an American citizen, and let alone a Christian, whatever your view is, you should care about that. Yeah. I mean, you should care about that as an American and as a Christian, because you care about the law. And we're called to love. We're commanded to love the Lord and to love people, multiple times by Jesus. And so, I mean, what other attacking a building because it represents something that you don't like, which is exactly what happened. That is absolutely morally reprehensible and is totally indefensible, regardless of, I don't care if Portland is extremely liberal. That whole area of Portland is extremely liberal, all the way down from Portland to, Salem and even up to Seattle. The Seattle area especially, but where I'm originally from the Seattle area, so I know that well. But that's the thing. It's not even just a political thing anymore. It's an ideology. It's a philosophy. It's a worldview, and we know that those things are inherently theological, and we have to talk about it that way. They are proposing a theology and a worldview, and telling us this is what they're going to do, and then. Whether the government is supporting them or backing them, we can have that debate, or whether they're an agent of the government, like some people say, or not. Right. We can talk about that, but I just want to camp on the idea that this is an ideology. It's evil. It's reprehensible. They're attacking people. And, they're being used to do things that are against the Constitution and against the law of the land. And whether you're a pacifist or not, you should care about that.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think that, if you look at my websites and look at my social media, you'll see I am the least political person, because number one, I'm in California. So part of that problem is that I know up front that doesn't matter how I vote, that my candidate is probably not going to win. And it doesn't matter what proposition I'm voting for or against, I'm probably not going to win that either. It's just the nature of being conservative, a religious, or a Christian conservative in a state that really is not leaning in that direction. So I get all that. But I always tell people I don't vote for candidates. I don't vote for people. I vote two ways. One, I vote for future potential realities. I'm voting for the potential future reality. Now, I'm looking at which candidate gets me to that future potential reality, which closely mirrors my Christian worldview. And sometimes you have to ride an ugly horse to get to a destination you're trying to get to. But I'm not voting for the horse. I'm voting for the destination the horse is going to. So that's just the nature of how I vote. Now, set number two, I vote based on priorities, because no candidate is going to agree with you 100%. So you have to ask yourself, what are my priorities? So, for example, they voted out the mayor of Chicago, largely because of the mess it has become from a policing perspective. Now, who did they vote back in? They voted in somebody who is ideologically identical to the old mayor, except for this one issue. That became the priority, that even though they agreed with her, the old mayor, in every other aspect, this is the one priority that she couldn't get right. So that voting constituency said, okay, you know what, we'll vote somebody else who's just like you, except for that one priority. And I think that's fair for us to decide in any election, well, what are our priorities? Like, what's the thing right now that threatens us the most? Threatens our freedoms, whatever it may be that is your priority. So I vote for potential future realities and priorities. And I just pick the candidate that best reflects those two interests. I'm not interested in people. And here's what happens. We become so interested in candidates that we're not even able or willing to say, well, yeah, there's like 16 ways this candidate is sideways to me. I don't agree with any of that. But here's the one issue I am concerned about. And if there was another alternative to this dude or this gal, I would pick it. But because there isn't, I'm stuck with that person. And that's why I don't talk about candidates. I talk about positions and I talk about priorities, because those to me are more important. And you'll see this law enforcement issue. If the communities, now this is also, you got to remember, this is a reality that seems to be, like, I'm in Southern California, but in Southern California, there's a very big difference between the county next to me and the county I'm living in. And all of the hot button issues up there don't happen down here. And we're very close proximity. We're touching. So this is an isolated issue that, for example, I'm sure that the county you're living in doesn't have the same problems that Portland does, and they're probably geographically pretty close. Mm-hmm. So that's why your priorities are different based on where you are. Mm-hmm. And so I think once it gets to a point where nationally there's a perception that this is becoming unsafe nationally, and I'm sure there are many places in the country where that's just not my priority. I'm sure that's happening in those crazy cities, and their view probably is, well, let them all burn. They need to see the bad consequence of bad ideas and let them all. But for where they're not necessarily voting for a candidate based on that priority. So I think what happens is these things do make the news, and as they make the news, for example, when George Floyd was killed, do you think that you think every we focused on one officer, although there were 800,000 others we could have talked about, many of which were doing unbelievable things, and that were dying at about one or two a month, more than that, in shootings that no one's paying attention to. There's an officer down memorial page. It's the ODMP. You should take a look at it. It'll update you. You can get notified every time an officer is killed in the line of duty. It's not fun. No. But I'll tell you that's happening. But we look at it through the lens of that one thing that makes the news. Well, crime makes the news. And so at some point, I think that what's happening in New York and in Portland and Minneapolis, in Chicago, there becomes a sense that, yeah, the country is becoming unstable. And then candidates start talking about refunding the police. Well, why? Because it's become the priority of a nation. So we'll see what happens.
That's really well said. I know we could camp on that for a long time.
No kidding.
But how should Christians think about the handling of high profile cases involving law enforcement from agencies like the FBI?
Yeah, it's a confidence issue. I mean, you when you lose confidence in your local municipal agency, you're in a terrible spot. When you lose confidence in the bottom foundation, like you're not sure you're standing on concrete or if you're standing on a brittle piece of paper, then it's really hard to take another step because you're not sure, am I stepping on something solid or not? And that's why it's so important in the high bar. And I spent the last 3 years of my agency just building their ethics program. Like, how do we teach ethics to officers? And one of the things I often said was this idea that, you are the foundation. You're the one necessary group in culture. That means you have a high bar. You can't make the smallest mistake. And if you don't see that as a privilege, get out, because you're making it hard for all the rest of us. So when it comes to things like the FBI, as we lose our confidence that it hasn't been politicized, we are going to lose our confidence that we're ever going to know the truth. I mean, so for example, we're under one administration now, and we're about split half and about 50-50, let's say, in the population, what side you might vote on in any given election. Okay, fine. So if you're in the half that's in office and the FBI under your regime, under your administration, I look on both sides, whatever you want. That FBI is not seen as anything other than the active arm of your administration, well, then no one's going to trust it. Yeah. And if that's where we're headed, this is why, for example, you do not want the national law enforcement to take over small. In other words, this idea that we don't have a kind of a set of standards that would they vary from municipality to municipality. So we need the federal government to come in and just do all of law enforcement. No, you don't want that. You don't want that, because one of the beauties of having a county like Los Angeles with over 30 different municipal agencies is it's really hard to get all 30 on the same page. So it's hard to corrupt them, because if you don't have a singular top-down kind of authority that can say, no, we're all doing this for my purpose, you can't convince 30 plus chiefs of police to go along with your program. Mm-hmm. And that's a good thing, because it's harder to corrupt the police if they aren't nationalized. Also, you don't want a national organization who's hiring people from Minnesota or people from New York City to be policing you in Lubbock, Texas. They don't know anything about you. They don't know anything about your culture. By the way, if you have to live with the people you police, that is a very good behavior check. You want people to live in the communities they police. They understand that they know who you are. You know who they are. And you don't want this to be nationalized, because then you're completely detached from the community in which you're working. You have no vested interest in that community. You want officers who have a vested interest in the well-being of this community and aren't just going to be transferred to Arizona next week. They're going to be here with you from the start to the finish of their career. They were born here. They're going to die here, and their kids were raised here. That's what you're looking for in terms of law enforcement. So yeah, I think that's what's happening here is we've got to be careful we want to use the FBI for a couple of reasons. One, if it's a federal issue. It used to be that bank money in banks was federally insured. So bank robberies used to be investigated by the FBI because there's a federal interest. It's federally insured money. Mm-hmm. Or they would hop in with us if we had a crime spree that was spanning more than one state. So they could kind of come in and oversee that this guy's, these two agencies are working in California, these two agencies are working in Nevada, and the FBI is coordinating it. Okay, great. So there's a role for the FBI, but it could never be to investigate the local stuff. Needs to be held at the local level.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think as I look at this issue when at the federal level, I'd be interested in what you think. Just I'll be brief here. I think it's an integrity issue. Lawyers and people that are politicians that are in the Justice Department, the FBI, and so on and so forth. They do go. I believe they will give them the benefit of the doubt. They do go in to right. maintain the. They swear to serve the people. They go and study. They get their doctorate in law, and all those things, I think by and large, we could say, okay. But I think what we have to understand is that the law, I think we could argue, is not to be political. You're supposed to judge impartially.
Right.
And I think the matter is a matter for the Christian, from a Christian worldview, the matter is one of integrity. And I think that, at least from my vantage point, as I look at it, I see the integrity of our Justice Department dwindling. And I see, people like the district attorney in, even right now, whatever you think of that Trump case. Okay, I don't even care. But I see what's behind that. And I see the things that he has said. And I just have to ask, like, you Whether you're a Christian or not, I don't know. Okay. That isn't even the issue. The issue is you're in the Justice Department or not in the Justice Department, but you're in the Attorney's Office of New York City. And here you are, you're supposed to be an agent of the court, a law officer. You're supposed to conduct yourself with integrity so that justice can be served. And I just have to ask the question here, where is the integrity, irrespective of the fact whether he's a Christian or not? Where's that at the heart of the law? If you have no integrity, how then people start really questioning these things. And I think as I think about that, that's what bothers me the most.
Well, here's what it is. You're supposed to be unaligned. You should not have an alliance. You don't go in, and I don't think people actually go into the FBI or any of these agencies as political operatives. But the problem is we all suspect that once you get there, you might become one. And so that's the problem, is where are you aligned? And that's why I kind of wonder, there's no way to take political views out of people who are in office, but we have to kind of ask ourselves this question. To me, it's a bigger issue. It's an issue of sex, money, and power. So those are the only three reasons I talk about all of my books. These are the only three reasons why anyone sins. There is not a fourth reason. Everything falls into one of those three categories. It's 1 John 2. But I didn't know it was 1 John. I just learned it working investigations. So what you have to do is guard the people who serve us as political servants from those three things. And it is always going to be money, sex, and power. So here's what I would say. We could change it all in a heartbeat. In 1 year, we could change the entire political structure for the good if we could take out those three things. And how you do that is you say, look, if you want to run for office, great. We're going to term limit everything. You can only run for 8 years maximum, period. You could never be a public servant. You can't go out for 4 years and come back. No, that's just the most anyone could ever serve. That means the power is going to get capped immediately because you cannot. 2, you will only be paid the average of the last 5 years you made privately. So if you learn to live on X number of dollars, then we're going to take that 5-year average and we're going to pay you that much. That's it. So that doesn't mean, so otherwise you got to pay him something so that you can get anyone who decides I want to run for office and I'm a middle-class dude who doesn't have, income. Well, then fine. We're going to match your income. Don't worry. Yeah. So we're going to do that. And of course we have to have the highest standards when it comes to sex and relationships. But I think if we term limited everything and got the money out of it, you would see tremendous change. Yeah. Because what would happen is it'd be really hard to start like long-term planning for parties when no one's going to be in the office more than 8 years. Like to strategize how to take over the country.
Yeah.
Because, it's one thing to get somebody who you always reelect and that he retains that mindset or she retains that mindset for their entire 40 years of service in Congress or 40 years of public service. Than to find what would actually be 5 different people to do the same job who all think like her or him.
Yeah.
So I think in the end, this is part of the problem is just the structure of how we have not term limited these folks, and we have to do it. And it's never going to happen because it would have to come from the very people who don't want to be term limited. So that's the problem though.
Yeah.
It's sex, money, and power. Just do what you have to do to take those 3 challenges out of government service and everything will change overnight.
That is really well said, brother. Another big issue that we're seeing is, this is my wife's question, actually. She sometimes contributes questions. How do Christian police respond to the insinuation that they're inherently racist?
Well, we are inherent otherists. So I just wrote a book where we're talking about this in one of the chapters. Everyone is an otherist. Here's what I mean. As we know that from the social science, that we are attracted to people who are like us. This idea that opposites attract, well, opposites in the sense that we're 2 different sides of the same coin. But that's been debunked by social scientists for years now. We marry people and we are attracted to people who hold the same views, who like the same things. As a matter of fact, our genetic material is more similar between married couples than it is between strangers because a lot of our behaviors are simply a reflection of our genetics. And so if we like the same kinds of behaviors, it's probably we like people who have similar genetics. So my point is that that means though, if you are always attracted to and affirming of people who are like you, that means you reject people or distance yourself from people who aren't. And this is true for every human on planet Earth.
Yeah.
We marry people who look like us, look like our family members. We do this over and over and over again. And I've collected all the data on this to see in every category, this is always true. And so I always say the problem is not racism, it's otherism. but everyone's an otherist. Everyone is. We have to kind of fight that natural tendency. The only thing that solves that is what I always say is that the gospel solves and cures every kind of stupid you can think of, including race stupid, marriage stupid, law enforcement stupid, every kind of stupid you can think of. The gospel has an answer for that. So once we adopt a view in which we see ourselves as descendants of Adam and Eve, as there's no distinction between the Jew and the Greek, between male and female, in terms of what, how God sees us as his children, then I think everything changes. It begins to change. Now, our police officers, we have to ask this question. Here's what we do. We don't get up I want to make this very clear. We go in at briefings every morning before we start a shift, the patrol briefings. We don't go in there and say, okay, guys, I want you to go. There's a certain group living in our town. We want to target that group. I don't know if that's what they think that we're doing or what. Let me tell you what we're doing. We're looking at crime stats. First thing, they're printed out. They're sitting on the desk. Well, it used to be now they're probably on your MDT, on your computer. But it used to be they would print these things out. They would have them on the desk. And so we would go in and we would say, okay, look, we got a bunch of overnight. There was a ton of car thefts from the West End. We got killed last night. We know that from the crime reports from the day before. So it was like 2 nights ago. So now we're working graveyard tonight. And all these crimes occurred like after dark, like really between like 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. So now between 1 and 5, what do you think we're doing? Now, by the way, one person said they saw 2 Asian males in a white Corolla, a Corolla type car, smaller kind of compact car. Okay. So now we're getting killed. They're stealing cars right and left. Now, what are we going to do? Tonight between 1 and 5, we're going to be in that neighborhood, blacked out, sitting, cruising up and down the alleys. We're looking for car thieves. And if there happen to be 2 Asian males drive by in a small white car, what do you think we're going to do? We're probably going to make sure those people are doing something they should be doing.
Yeah.
Now, we're not doing that because we don't like Asian males or white cars. We're doing that based on the crime reports from 2 nights earlier. And so what happened, and by the way, unless the crime reporter is racist, we're only going to look for those people who we see on the reports that were matching the description. That's how you do the job. We want success. We're not going to stop just anybody. We're going to stop people who match the descriptions for those kind. Now, if we have a street robbery series, and let's say that suspect happens to be Hispanic or Black, now we're going to get accused of racism if we start stopping Hispanics or Black who are slowly driving down. They may just be slowly driving down the street, not looking at people walking on the street. They're just looking for a place to park. But we know from past descriptions from 2 nights ago on the crime report, so we're going to end up talking to those people, and we're going to be seen as innately racist. So I get it. This is why a lot of police officers have said, well, you know what? That we don't have to do that work anymore. See, remember, cops are not just reactive. We're proactive. Like, you want us to stop that series by stopping the next crime before it occurs. That's not what firemen do. They only react. There's no patrol division in the fire department. There's a patrol division in law enforcement because you want us to suppress crime. But we don't have to do that. We'll be happy just to respond and take reports. And maybe someone in the detectives will figure it out and make the arrest. We don't even have to worry about it, especially if every time we're going to go out there and proactively do our job that you asked us to do, you're going to accuse us of racism. Now, are there racist cops? Yeah, absolutely. There's racist doctors, I'm sure, too. And there's probably racist firemen. We're all otherists. And and by the way, race, skin color, is just the laziest form of otherism you can possibly think about. But I'll tell you this. If we were all the exact same race, exact same sex, and we looked identical, we would just find another reason to separate. We'd say, I live on the even side of the street. All you people live on the odd side of the street. You odd people, you're odd. So we'd find something else to separate. Why? Because we are innately otherists. And it's all a pride issue, right? I like me so much that I want other people who are like me. That's just a pride issue. Yeah. So in the end, I think that, yes, I would say, are there racist cops? Yes. But a lot of what we do is not based on race. It's based on crimes descriptions. And that's why if you look at the crime reports that are collected across America, unless you're going to argue that all those millions of people who report crimes are collectively working together to falsely report that one race is the one you should be looking for. And it's different in every community. I mean, it's like I said, on the West Side, it's probably not going to be 2 black guys in a car. It's probably going to be something else. And we're just going to have to figure out what that is. And once we get the report, then we're going to go after that. But again, it's not like we're choosing who we're going after. We're trying to do it in response to observations made by people who file reports.
That is really good. You know, we've seen this next question in action recently, especially at universities and colleges. And it's something that we should definitely think long and hard of, because I think we're going to see it continue. But how should Christian police respond to the growing challenge of the LGBTQT plus community and their growing violent protests?
Well, again, like I said before, the Antifa, the same way you would respond to any group, because look, we're not concerned we are enforcing the law, not enforcing some view of race. It's the law. Don't violate the law. No, we don't have a purview outside of that. We're only going to get involved if the law is violated. So you remember when you were a kid and when you raise kids, you recognize this is what works quickly. If you want to stop behavior, it's immediate and severe punishment that changes behavior. Now, I say severe, I don't mean like a spanking or necessarily like a beating. I'm saying if for that kid, having this privilege revoked for a week that's like over the top. Great. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to enact that immediately. You did this thing yesterday. I told you 5 times not to do it. I don't want to punish you. I'm not punishing because I hate you. I'm punishing because I'm trying to correct future behavior. So therefore, I'm going to do this severe thing in your eyes, this severe thing, and I'm going to immediately make it effective. That's why we have a terrible system right now for juveniles, because we do not do anything severe to young people committing major crimes. And 2, we wait forever to even bring them to court. So they have a sense that, whatever, and they just keep on doing this stuff. You'll see this in the juvenile justice system, but that's another story. But when it comes to this, I would say, look, if there's laws being broken, you do it the exact same way without any distinction whatsoever, because we don't care about the nature of the perpetrator. We care about the nature of the law the perpetrator is violating. And that's it. So I just think, by the way, for every generation, there's going to be a new group that has a new set of issues that is going to be the problem we're going to have to deal with in that generation. Yeah. And, where it may have been organized crime of a certain type in New York City, when that was finally or not eradicated, but, changed or shifted or whatever it had to do to kind of suppress it, something else is going to pop up in its place. That evil is one of those things that once the void is there, something takes its place every time.
Oh, yeah.
I remember, for example, for years, these guys would do a street robbery or do a liquor store robbery to make what, $50 at a gunpoint. Well, we suppressed that by making the use of a gun an extra allegation, and it was an extra penalty. We made it so severe that people stopped doing that. And the same people that said, well, you know what, we're going to start washing checks because we can make thousands of dollars and there's hardly any penalty but those days for washing checks, for changing checks and using the checks with the banks to forge money, check forgeries. And then suddenly the same guys we used to see driving around with a gun under their seat because they're getting ready to do a robbery, we're now driving around with all the materials you use to wash checks in the back of the van. So we're like, really? This is an interesting shift. So then the laws get changed. So suddenly that's a huge penalty. And now it shifts to another kind of crime. We just keep on pushing, but we're never going to eradicate bad behavior if we just push it from one group to another or from one type of crime to another. So I always say that, this LGBTQ plus stuff is going to be interesting, especially I have no interest in it unless it becomes violent and it violates a crime that I'm stuck having to enforce. Well, then it's an issue for us. Until it is, it's not an issue for us. I don't care what group is out there doing stupid. I only care that at some point I'm going to have to respond to stupid.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, brother, tell us where our listeners and those who watch this can find you on social media. Tell us about your website and your podcast as well.
Well, we do a podcast. It's called the Cold Case Christianity Podcast. Now, I get a chance to talk about these kinds of things. Probably in a year from now, I'll eventually repost this conversation with you and point people back to your podcast as well. But a lot of what we do is for law enforcement is, our website is coldcasechristianity.com. But so that's really basically a kind of a detective's perspective looking at Christianity. But our website, thethinbluelife.com, the Thin Blue Life, that is Christianity's perspective of law enforcement. It's just the opposite. So it's, instead of looking at Christianity from an investigator's perspective, we're looking at law enforcement from a Christian perspective. And so we only post there once a week, but I've got a small team of people who contribute to that website. And what we're trying to do is to help officers who maybe haven't considered Christianity at all to consider it for the first time. And those who are believers who are working in this industry to kind of give them some support and some resources to kind of be encouragement to continue to fight the fight. And the fight really isn't against bad guys. The fight right now is against culture. Like, how do we continue to do this job? Because I'll tell you, Dave, people are retiring at scary rates right now. There's not an agency in the country, I'll bet you, that isn't at its all-time lowest in terms of staffing. I'll bet you that's true for my agency. It's true for Los Angeles County agencies. We can't hire. And everyone who's here is thinking it's time to leave. So I think that's the problem, is that are we prepared to live in a world where we just stop doing certain things? And that's what's going to happen. What I think is going to happen is we're going to end up without sworn police personnel doing patrol work. Instead, When a crime occurs, we'll send out a civilian service officer who will take the report, and that report will come back to a sworn detective who's a police officer who will just investigate everything in hindsight. Because we're down to such numbers, we have to make a decision. Where do we put our resources? And at some point, it's not going to be, you're never going to be able to hire anybody who's going to want to do proactive police work anymore. So now we're going to be just taking reports, and civilians can do that. If I have a robbery right now and we're going to rush to stop the robbery, well, how about this? We'll just come out in 2 hours and take a report. Well, anyone can do that. So I think that's my fear, is that we are going to head in a direction where we are no longer going to staff, and we're not going to feel bad about it. So I don't think we're there yet, but look, we didn't think AI was going to be here 10 years ago, and here we are. And now we're getting ready to see AI take over the world. So I think it's important for us to at least think about where this is headed.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this conversation, speak to, the officer, why they should keep doing what they're doing, and speak to the citizen, and about, how they should think about, that, the police officer.
Well, I always say no one should take a blind approach to either one of these things. If you're a police officer, you don't have to take a blind approach. You have to understand that we have the highest standard. And if you can't uphold that highest standard, then it is time for you to find another place to work. And if you're seeing somebody else who is not holding up to the highest standard, it's time for you to engage it. And a lot of times you're going to, look, it's impossible. If a few good officers are in an agency and all they do is run to their supervisors constantly to complain about other officers, well, eventually they're going to leave, because no one's going to. You change people on a personal relationship, one-on-one basis. If you've got someone in your life as a police officer who you don't think is doing the job the way it ought to be done, talk to them, have coffee with them, make it personal. And if you're a civilian who's watching all of this nonsense, I get it. I don't think you should take it that blindly either. We need to treat evil as evil, regardless of who does evil. And if it's a police officer, then that I think the highest possible standard. But at the same time, understand that we don't typically hire bad people, but the job does eventually change who you are as a person. And so the question is, what is it about the job? And so I think there are some things we could do to do better in police work. We could rotate people out of certain positions. For example, Dave, we don't leave people in sex crime investigations very long because it has a tendency to mess with your head. So we have a cap. You got to rotate out. You can't come back in. And that keeps people from being twisted by the kind of twisted behavior of others that they're constantly looking at. Same thing is probably going to need to be true for patrol. If you're going to do this job, at some point, we need to have a way to rotate you out into some other position where you can get some balance in your life. And if you're in an agency or you're in a city right now as a civilian and you see that doesn't really happen in your agency, then understand that that's, you have to factor that in. Because when you see somebody who's been doing this for, I've been a patrol officer for 15 years, red flag, you should know something about that. That's a red flag. If anyone does that job for more than 5 years, probably at some point is going to get sour on people, and you don't want that to happen. So just think about it the same way you would if this is your kid who wanted to be in law enforcement. What would be the advice? What would be, how much grace would you offer? What would be the limits in terms of the kind of grace you would offer? If it was your child, you'd think of it differently. And so I think that's an approach for me, as I always think about it, because it is my kid, my son's in it. I never worried about me, but I worry about him all the time now. So I think that's part of the process too, for those who aren't police officers.
That's really good. Well, brother, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to these issues, and not only that, but to provide care and help to our officers. I think that it is such an important thing. It's like growing up as a son of a lieutenant colonel. It's like walking up to an officer or a non-commissioned officer and thanking them. But I do the same with a police officer, fireman, and it goes a long way. So I just want to say thank you for coming on.
I appreciate it.
You too. And thank you for speaking to these issues. They really matter, I think. So
yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, rate us on the app, and share this with your friends and family on social media. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Twitter @Servants of Grace, on Instagram @Servants of Grace, or by searching @Servants of Grace on Facebook. You can also find this episode and many others like it on the front page of our website, servantsofgrace.org.